Okay, so talking today about cognitive development during the first 2 years of life, specifically focusing on Piaget's theory of cognitive development. All right, so in Piaget's theory, he believed that children start to think in terms of what he called schemes or schemas. And so in Piaget's theory, a schema is a psychological structure. It's basically a way that we organize and make sense of the kinds of experiences that we have. So for example, you might have a schema about animals, okay? And so animals represents this broad term, and from that category, we try to organize and understand our experiences with animals. So within that broad category, we might have, subcategories about farm animals or zoo animals or something like that. So how do we build these schemas? So Piaget believed that children are going through two particular processes in building schemas. And these processes of learning are called assimilation and accommodation. So with assimilation, you're basically taking what you already know and using it to understand what is going on around you. So you're taking the category, the schema that you already have, and incorporating or assimilating new information into that category. So for example, let's say that you have a schema for dog, and a child learns the word for dog, and then they start to call all four-legged animals dogs. Okay, so they're taking that category, that schema of dog, and using it to organize new information. So you can probably see how sometimes there will be errors, right? What if a child encounters a cat and they see the cat and they call the cat dog because according to their schema, all things with four legs are dogs. That is where the process of accommodation comes in. So with accommodation, you have to change, you have to accommodate the old schema and create a new one to fit, to accommodate the new information that you're learning. So the child calls the cat a dog, and then people around them say, no, that's not a dog, that's a cat. Then the schema for dog gets modified to restrict it to only certain four-legged animals. So the child has to modify that existing schema. So one way to keep these straight in your mind, assimilation has two S's in it, right? SS, you can think of that as standing for same schema. So with assimilation, you're using the same schema. You're not changing it at all. You're applying the same schema to understand information. With accommodation, you have to change, right? So that's the C here. You have to change your schema or create a new schema to accommodate the new information. So that's one way to keep those two straight. Okay, so the sensorimotor stage. So this is the stage of cognitive development that Piaget proposed for children who are in the first 2 years of life. And so with the sensorimotor stage, remember, children are learning. Children are thinking by coordinating their senses and motor movement. Okay, so they're coordinating their 5 senses with movement. And in the sensorimotor stage, Piaget believed that children basically build up to intentional behaviors. So initially, children perform some kind of behavior purely by accident, and then they produce some kind of effect, and they do the behavior again and again and again. This is where this term circular reaction comes in, okay? It's some kind of behavior that a child initially does purely by accident. It produces some kind of effect, and the child does it again and again and again. The behavior goes in a circle. So take, for example, something like a child learning how to, let's say, smack their mouth or something like that, or like smack their tongue to make like a kind of sound. So initially, the child doesn't set out to do that, right? They don't set out to make the sound. But maybe as they are playing, they find that they can do that. They can make that noise. It produces a pleasurable response. They're like, oh, I like that noise. That's fun. I'm going to keep doing that. And then the behavior starts to become intentional. So at first, the behavior is accidental. They discover things basically by accident. It produces some kind of pleasurable effect, pleasurable response, and it becomes an intentional behavior. Another good example, thumb sucking. So perhaps initially the child accidentally puts her thumb in her mouth and it produces a pleasurable effect. She's like, wow, this is great. This is really soothing. I like this. In the future, then, she's going to keep doing that, right? That's going to become an intentional behavior that she does on purpose because it produces that pleasurable response, okay? So children initially explore these things, they uncover these behaviors by accident, and then they become increasingly more and more purposeful and intentional. Okay, so object permanence, this is the major accomplishment within this particular stage of development. So children prior to about 6 months of age don't understand that an object continues to exist even when they cannot see it. Okay, so for kids who are under about 6 months of age, it's almost like out of sight, out of mind. So object permanence is a major accomplishment here. You can tell when a child has achieved object permanence because you might try to hide, let's say, your keys, which they want to put in their mouths and suck on them, and you're like, that's disgusting. These keys are so dirty. You try to hide the keys in your pocket. For a child who has achieved object permanence, this child's like, oh, I am too smart for you. I know that those keys continue to exist even when you have tried to hide them, right? Even when they are in your pocket. And so the child will continue to search for the keys. So object permanence then, we see that with this full understanding of object permanence, the child can then move into understanding something called invisible displacement. So this is basically a child's ability to observe or to watch, to see a behavior, and then do it again later on down the line, to copy that behavior later on down the line. So we see this used often in make-believe play, right? In pretend play, which starts to surface during the first couple of years. So children might make-believe play something like playing house or playing doctor. That involves invisible displacement. They have already experienced what it's like to go to the doctor, right, at one point in time, and then they can imitate that later on down the line, right? They can remember that behavior and then copy it later on in their make-believe play. So this is a big step, right, in terms of the developing child's cognitive capacities. So other cognitive gains that we see during infancy and toddlerhood. So kids are improving how efficiently they can pay attention and also how quickly they can shift focus from one thing to the next. So if you look at very, very young infants, they have a hard time looking at one thing and then quickly switching to another thing. But as they continue to grow during the first couple of years, they become better at that, right? At being able to shift from one object to the next. They're also less attracted by novelty. So that means new things, new objects. And they can pay attention to things for slightly longer periods of time. Remember that attention is a particular cognitive capacity that will continue to grow well into adolescence and into adulthood also. We also see improvements in memory, so longer retention intervals. So this means that infants can actually remember information for longer periods of time from the first time that they were exposed to that information. So as they continue to grow during the first year, they can sustain that for longer periods of time. The ability to recall information by about the second half of the first year. So that capacity is growing here as well. We also see something that's called infantile amnesia. So this is the phenomenon that individuals can often not recall memories before the age of about 3. So there are a number of reasons that this could potentially occur. Some of them have to do with how the brain is developing, so the particular structures that are involved in memory are not mature enough in the developing child for the child to have that particular capacity. Other things have to do with the child's emerging sense of self. So in previous chapters, we talked about how this child begins to develop this sense of independence, this sense that you are a separate, autonomous being. You are separate from your mom, you're separate from your dad, and certain memories require that you understand yourself perhaps in relation to other people as well, and that sense of self doesn't develop until a little bit later on, and that can help explain part of this infantile amnesia as well. Okay, so how do we measure intelligence in infants? So this is a tough one. One of the most common measures is something called the Bayley Scales of Infant Intelligence. These look at a number of different areas: cognitive abilities, language abilities, motor, social and emotional functioning, and adaptive behaviors. So cognitive scales might give the child a set of directions and see if the child can follow them. Language might ask the child to define something or show them a particular object and ask them what it's called. Motor skills look at movement, so we might give a child a stack of blocks and see if they can build a tower. Social and emotional and adaptive behavior are both rated by the parent, so the parent basically gives you a report on how the child's doing in these areas. So social and emotional are things like, how well does this child get along in a group of other kids? How well does this child calm down when really upset about something? And adaptive behavior, this can be basically, how does the child deal with kind of everyday stuff? Is the child functioning at an age-appropriate level? Things like, helping the child, or is the child able to, feed themselves in a relatively age-appropriate manner or get themselves dressed in an age-appropriate way? The Bayley scales are largely unpredictive of intelligence later on down the line. So if we look at how strongly the score on one of the Bayley scales correlates with intelligence in later childhood, very small correlation here. They're used mostly for screening, so to look for developmental delays, to look for atypical or abnormal child development is their primary use. One of the reasons that these tests are not really related to later intelligence is that first, it's a long test. These kids get fatigued, right? These tests can take several hours, and so oftentimes, kids are just not interested in going through these tests, and so a lot of times they just don't really predict what the child is going to be like later on in terms of their intellectual capacity.